Special thanks to ArtCake for sponsoring today's event. And now I'll introduce our host and our guest. Suzanne Bocanegra employs theater to interrogate the history and practice of visual art using large-scale video, performance, and installation, as well as collage, sculpture, and painting. Solo shows include Wardrobe Test at ArtCake in Brooklyn, Poorly Watched Girls at the Fabric Workshop and Museum, I Write the Songs at the Tang Museum, and among many others. Her performances have been presented at the Museum of Modern Art, the Carnegie Museum, the Hammer Museum, the Mitchell Center, UCLA Center for the Art and Performance, and also many other places. In 2020, Bocanegra received the Robert Rauschenberg Award from the Foundation for Contemporary Arts and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's currently working on a performance co-commissioned by the Met, UCLA's Art of Performance Center, and the ICA Boston. Amanda Gluibizzi, our host today, is the editor of the art scene section of the Brooklyn Rail. She is also an art historian and the co-director of the New Foundation for Art History. Her book, Art and Design in the 1960s New York, is forthcoming. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Amanda, and you and Suzanne can take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining in with us. I hope wherever you are, you're having a lovely day. And also, I should say Happy Mother's Day to all of those of you who are mothers who have mothers, and I assume that's most of you. Hopefully it will be a very, very nice weekend. Since I'm an art historian, I have to talk a little bit about education here. So let me just tell you that Suzanne Bocanegra got her BFA from UT Austin, and then a few years later got her MFA from the San Francisco Art Institute. She's originally from Texas, and she currently lives in New York City, although she was just telling us before we started that she's in Texas right now, waiting out the COVID virus, as so many of us are doing in places other than where we normally live. Suzanne, welcome, and thank you so much for participating with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful, thank you. First, I guess I should just ask, how are you working right now during COVID? Since you're away from your normal home, what does your studio production look like?
Well, it's strange. I mean, the whole reason I'm in Texas is because my mom died unexpectedly a month ago. And so, we came down here to her suburban house, and I came down here with my husband and my 3 kids. And after we were here, we realized there was no reason to go back to New York. I mean, everything had been canceled. There was nothing going on. And plus, we live in a very small, we live in a regular New York kind of situations with 1 toilet, and it's 5 of us. And so we thought we'd just stay here. And so I've been just sort of swimming through all of my mom's stuff, and living in it. And there's something very comforting about it, and also something very strange about it. But anyway, I cleared off her vanity table, and I'm doing drawings and costume drawings for Come and Go, which is a Beckett play with 3 women. And then I'm working on Honor, which is the new lecture performance that I've been working on for a while, and I workshopped at UCLA. And but when I left New York, we have a little theater in our house. Maybe that's why there's not so much room. But we were going to do a production of Quad, this Beckett play. And of course, we didn't do it. And so now I'm thinking maybe I'll do it here. I mean, we have enough people, and my husband's a composer. He can do the percussion, and I can make the costumes out of my mom's old clothes. So I thought, maybe we'll do a little production here just for ourselves.
Have you floated that to your family yet?
Yeah, they're into it.
Okay, good. Although I think perhaps like performing Beckett under duress could also be really interesting, a fascinating way of channeling something there.
I know, he's a really interesting person to look at during this time because of his worldview. And also I think it would be really good to add that to our life here, because we're in this kind of on the suburban island, you know, with this huge yard, and everything's really nice in a way, you know, nice, and it's a world I couldn't wait to get away from, actually. But so it's nice to kind of bring that Beckett in there to just sort of balance them all out. We'll see. I don't know how it's going to work.
We have Beckettian weather in New York right now, so at least if nothing else, you'll be able to like counterbalance, I'm assuming, nice Texas weather with something.
It's sunny, that's for sure.
Okay, good. So I know that you've gone to Texas for others of your works. I'm mostly thinking of Farmhouse Whorehouse, and have done research there because, of course, that's where you're from. And so it's kind of interesting then to think about being in Texas to do work that you didn't intend to be in Texas for. And so I'm kind of curious about that. Has it kind of altered the way you think about your process?
My process is always the same. It's always like meandering, just going here, there, and everywhere. I mean, in my normal life, I have access to the Princeton Library, and I spend a lot of time just wandering the stacks. And I can't do that here, but you can still wander around the internet. And I've already ordered a ton of books that have come, and then I can download a lot of books from the Princeton Library. And so I just kind of like wander around and just see what kind of speaks to me, and take a look at it, and then maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. And then I make notes on index cards of different ideas. And then as the years have gone by, I have a lot of those, and I spend a lot of time sorting them and resorting them and sort of coming up gradually with different ideas. So that hasn't changed.
Okay. Good. About how long does it take you usually to work fully on the development of a piece to the point where you feel like it's achieved?
They're all really different, and a lot of times it depends when my deadline is, you know. So
isn't that the truth?
Because I can keep looking and reading stuff forever, you know.
Yeah.
And then finally somebody gives you a deadline and say, I got to wrap this up, you know. And so you start putting it all together and putting it in final form.
I'm looking at my boss, Charlie, right now and watching him laugh, and the line in his forehead gets worse and worse as he starts thinking about, about deadlines for everyone right now.
Yeah.
But it is totally true. I think it's actually really important to work within limits. That's interesting to me to hear from you, though. It's not very often that an art historian would hear an artist speak to the importance of a limit beyond the limit that he or she would set. You know, thinking about like a performance and setting out rules and then following the rules or something like that. But actually thinking about something that's imposed on you from the outside is really interesting.
Well, I think the reason that happens, especially in theater, is it's so collaborative. So rehearsals have to be scheduled, and actors have to be cast, and the director has to be there, and the technical, I mean, you have to get all these people together and coordinate them. And so there's no way you can do that without a schedule and without a deadline.
Right.
So, but whereas if I think you're just, you're making some paintings, you know, I think you can, you know, you can take a painting, you can work on it for a while, you can put it aside for a year and take it out a year later. And until you have, you might even have a show coming up, but you don't have to put that painting in there.
Right.
You know, so I think you can determine when something's finished on your own time.
You mentioning the idea of working with multiple people, your actors, the whatever sort of production crew you might have, the theater that you might perform it in, you know, the people who are working with them on the advertising and things like that. It calls to mind for me, Valley, one of your recent pieces that was included in Poorly Watched Girls. And that piece includes an 8-channel video. And so it's 8 different screens. I saw it at Art Cake, and it was projected 2 to a wall, and then there was a wall in the middle, and there was a projection on either side, and featured 8 different actors, all of whom are superstars in their field. You know, we're talking about Wendy Whalen of the New York City Ballet, for example, Carrie Mae Weems, you know, people that our audience listening right now would really know about. So can you tell me a little bit about how was it to work with all of those people? What was the time frame there? They were wearing earpieces, so very similar to your artist lectures. So we know that you were, oh, great, we have some imagery here. So we know that you were helping them to start to kind of envision what you were hoping for. But could you speak a little bit about this piece?
Well, I actually thought, you know, we recreated as closely as possible this wardrobe test that Judy Garland did near the end of her life for Valley of the Dolls. And she was originally cast in Valley of the Dolls, but then they fired her a couple weeks into the production. But I was really struck by this wardrobe test of hers, which is just a technical thing that they're doing to just see how the clothes look on her and how to light them. But so it's not scripted. She was just talking, and it was clear that she was trying to be really affable and really, because she really wanted this job. Nobody would hire her at that point. And she was cast in the role, even though she was in such bad shape at that time in her life, because one of the characters was loosely based on her life. So she was cast because of who she was. And so then I started thinking about recreating that. And then I started thinking, well, casting is really important. So these women are cast because of who they are and what they bring in their own personal life to this performance. And they're all very different. They all do different things. And then the way we did the production, we had to do it really quickly because it's very expensive. I did it with the Fabric Workshop, I should say that, and they were amazing, and they helped with all the production. And it's expensive to rent a place, a studio, and to get a really good DP and sound person. All that stuff is really expensive. So we had to do it really quickly. And also, all of these women don't have a lot of time. So we tried to do it really efficiently. And we did each one in about half a day. And we did the in-ear piece, so they didn't have to memorize. I don't know what else we had a movement coach, so to help with the movement.
That's really interesting to me. One of the things that I noticed when I was watching the videos is how distinct the dancers were in the videos. So you had Deborah Hay and Wendy Whalen, choreographers and dancers themselves. And one of the things that I remember learning when I was a child and was in ballet is that as you're waiting for your instruction, you constantly move so that you are tying movements together even as you're being told what to do. And it was really interesting to see that that is something that both of them did. Really fascinating. If one is trained in dance, one can understand who the dancers are in this performance piece. One of the other things I was really interested in too is how each woman represented the smile that Garland gives at a certain point in the screen test. Some are smiling with huge full lips, and one woman in particular was smiling a really tight smile, like she was feeling the anxiety or something that Garland would have felt. And that also was really, really fascinating to me, that they're channeling this persona, but also they can't help but bring their own interpretations of that persona to bear.
That's the amazing thing about performers. I mean, they're channeling somebody else, but they're still so much and so uniquely them. How how else could they do it? And also the other person who picked up on that kind of mimicking is Kate Valk, who does it all the time for the Worcester group. So she had it down in like no time. But yeah, it's amazing.
Since I'm an art historian, I have to ask you an art historical question. Were you thinking about Andy Warhol's screen tests at all?
I mean, no, not really. I mean, I know that they're there, but that didn't help me think of this project. That's not what made me come up with this. If anything, I would think it's more like looking at the Wooster group and more theatrical things. Yeah.
How did you cast these actors?
Well, they're all women whose work I really admire. And they're all different. I mean, they all do different things. So so I just kind of put together a wish list, and I wanted it to be I wanted them to overwhelm you, and I wanted them to be sort of like a valley, and I wanted them to be just formally powerful just by the oversized projections. And so I just made a wish list of people that I really wanted to be in the piece, and then asked them, and they were able to do it. I didn't know if I would be able to talk Ann Carson into it, because she performs her own work, but she doesn't really do this stuff. But artists are game for things. They'll try new stuff.
I thought Ann Carson was the most poignant of them. She was very well, I mean, as we've already said, very much herself. One of the things that I noticed is that she had a big Band-Aid on her hand. And wasn't self-conscious about it at all. It was just part of herself, and so just was doing the movements as was expected of her.
She's a very elegant mover. It was just so interesting to watch her.
It's fascinating too when you watch her lectures. She has a very interesting, almost halting reading of her own work. But of course, so much of her work is about Eros. And so it was really, really fascinating to see her have these kind of sensuous movements, even at the same time that you could understand where that voice is coming from. So we're looking right now at one of my favorites from this show that was at Art Cake. This was the dialogue of the Carmelites, the images of nuns that we're just looking at. I was fascinated by this. I went to Catholic school from first grade to 12th grade, so I've thought a lot about nuns. And my husband, his aunts, 3 of them were nuns. And so we have this like weird Catholic relationship to nuns. In the review, a lot of nuns. In the review, I noted that one of the orders required women to pay a dowry to belong to it. That was the order that my husband's aunts belonged to. That's a really, really interesting way of thinking about being a bride of Christ.
Right.
So I'm really, really interested in this. What drew you to the Religious Sisters as content?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and I went to Catholic schools, and I always wanted to be a nun because they were so cool. I mean, I was taught by nuns, and they were independent women. I mean, in the world I grew up in, it was like you were married and had a family, or you were a nun. It was just like that was the choices, and they wore these amazing medieval outfits. And this is Texas, and it's so hot, and they'd have layers and layers of perfectly starched linen and cotton, and then they'd have this I forgot what you call it, but the only thing that stuck out was their face.
Yeah, that's the wimple.
And then they had a big the Dominican nuns ran my school, and they had this big black leather belt with a huge rosary. The crucifix was like this big. And, you know, I would stare at these women all day long, and I would just think, I want that, you know. And a lot of it was about the costuming. And so I was interested in these operas about nuns, like Dialogue of the Carmelites. And it's a mid-century opera by Poulenc. And I started thinking, well, you know, how could you translate that whole idea of an opera about nuns, but put it in somehow, put it in a gallery setting? So I ended up, you know, getting a lot of books about nuns. And one of the ones that I ran across was this one. It's a guide to the Catholic sisterhood, and it's from the late 50s. And so it's 20th century. But when you read, it's almost like a birding book. Like it has, each page has a nun, her order, and what are the requirements and what the habit is. And it just was amazing to me that in the 20th century, the requirements for some of these nuns was like a dowry, or it would say things like must be of legitimate birth and have proof, or nobody with a birth defect. I mean, some of the requirements I just was sort of flabbergasted by. And I guess I had, in my mind, I thought things had progressed a lot further by the 20th century, but it still seemed medieval. And so I decided that I wanted to use all these photos of nuns. It's a really curious book because each photo is very different. Some are snapshots, some are formal portraits. I am sure one of them is a picture of Ingrid Bergman from the Bells of St. Mary's. And so it's kind of, the photos are all very different. So I decided to use these women as my cast, and then I costumed them. And so I sewed directly, and actually this was also done in conjunction with the fabric workshop. So with the fabric workshop, they hired a bunch of people to embroider, and I embroidered too, and we basically costumed all the nuns. And also, as I was doing it, I was still reading about nuns, and back in medieval times, they used to actually embroider their prayer books, just as a way to embellish and to decorate. Mm-hmm. And then I decided I needed a soundtrack, and so my husband is a composer, and so I asked him to write something. And then we started, you know, talking with each other and about how these women have signed up for a life of community, and for the rest of their life, they're never alone. So, so the text of the music that accompanies it is an autocomplete from the internet. When I'm alone is the question, and then it's auto-completed by a crowdsourcing method. And then it's sung by Caroline Shaw. So, and then I worked with this sound designer, Jody Elf, to make it kind of, you know, have that same kind of religious chapel, contemplative sort of feeling to the piece.
Yeah, at Art Cake, it was physically removed from the other pieces that were on display. They flowed into each other, but this one was actually installed behind a closed door. And so it was cloistered, if you will. It was very, very deliberate in the installation. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say it has to be, because the music is very soft. And if there's any other sound from any other part, like, you know, the ballet piece had sound. So it has to, in order for it to work, it has to be sequestered off from other things.
Yes. One of the things that really struck me is that so often nuns were expected to take, and are expected to take, vows of poverty. which is not something that's expected necessarily of priests, but it is often of nuns. And at the same time, many of the orders also had them wearing jewelry, essentially, that would have been fairly expensive to produce. One of the things that struck me when I was reading the descriptions was there was an order that wore a crucifix on the outside and then wore a monstrance underneath their entire outfit. The monstrance, for those of you who aren't Catholic, is the apparatus that rests on the high altar in a Catholic church, and it holds the communion wafer. So it basically allows the communion wafer to be in majesty when it's not being held by the priest or being put into the tabernacle away from sight. And so this was really interesting then to see how you were delineating and really drawing our attention to these markers of the women. It wasn't just the habits that they're wearing that identify their orders. It was in fact these accoutrements, these jewels that were also telling us who they are and what they chose in terms of the order that they chose to be involved in.
Yeah, some have it, some don't. They don't all have a crucifix. Yeah, it depends on, and some of them have these wackadoodle head things. You just can't. Where did that come from? But it all came from medieval times. A lot of it, and it was normal back then. And it's so interesting that the Catholic Church chose to keep that, and use it as a way to set these women apart. Well, until the 60s.
Yeah. In the 60s, a lot of orders modernized. And so the women were still required to wear a certain amounts of uniforms or crucifix or something like that, but they weren't necessarily required to wear the full habit, although they could choose to.
They could choose to, but the nuns in our parish, they could just wear whatever, And they first started with they'd have a little bitty veil. And then it just got looser and looser and looser.
Yeah.
So.
At my high school.
It's very sad.
At my high school, all of the nuns were in street clothes, except for one very, very fearsome nun, Sister Mary Sheila, who was still in their traditional outfit with a huge starched cardboard wimple that stood out from her chest by about a foot. And she wore a wooden rosary around her waist and would walk up and down the aisles of our classroom. And if you weren't paying attention, she would take the rosary and smack it on your desk. Which I don't know how Jesus would have felt about that, but that's between her and him.
Yeah, some of those nuns were really, really out there. And some of them were really good-hearted and were there because they wanted to do good in the world. Yes. It was a real mixed bag.
Absolutely.
That's for sure.
Absolutely. And I think you're really getting at something, too, when you talk about how this is related to the Middle Ages. Because, of course, throughout most of history, becoming a nun, first of all, was an option for women who weren't able to be married, but also it was an option for women who wanted to be educated. And, so this is something that continued well through the 20th century, that, many nuns chose to become them because it was one of the ways that they could pursue an education.
And sometimes they were forced into it by their families too, because their families didn't want to pay a dowry to make a good marriage, or they had too many daughters, and this was a way to just kind of get them out of the way. Yeah. It's been used for all kinds of things, and I don't know. It is a really fascinating world to stick your head into.
Yeah, it's interesting too that you mentioned Ingrid Bergman, because of course this is a weird moment where nuns become very popular in popular culture as well. So obviously the Bells of St. Mary's, but we can also think about The Sound of Music and the TV program
The Flying
Nun. Yes, The Flying Nun.
Yes. God, have you watched that? I mean, I watched that when I was, doing all this stuff about the nuns. It is unwatchable. It's so bad. You just can't believe it. And it was popular.
I know.
Crazy. But yeah, there was a singing nun, and also that was with Debbie Reynolds, and that's unwatchable too. But and then the story of the real singing nun is fascinating, and I had a record, of course, and it's Dominique. I mean, is this like before your time, or did you ever hear that song, Dominique? It was more popular and sold more records that year than the Beatles.
Well, of course it did. That was before my time, but I did watch The Flying Nun on, like, I forget what, Nick at Night or something like that. So yeah. One of the things that makes me think about, though, is iconography. These nuns are wearing basically symbols to suggest who they are and what order they belong to and how they choose to live their lives. And as an art historian, iconography is always one of those things that we're taught both to understand, but also to be wary of, because of course you can travel down a path where you think that symbols in works of art can unlock the meaning of the work of art, and it flattens the work and doesn't permit it to have its full weirdness. And so I'm really interested in this about your work, because you seem to be really adept at using personal symbols, symbols from orders. So how do you manage symbolism or iconography in your pieces?
I've been thinking about iconography a lot because I'm doing this piece that's on a 16th century tapestry, and iconography was codified. There was this guy, you probably know, Cesare Ripa, who wrote the, I don't know how to say it, Iconologia.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Iconologia.
Yeah. And so if you were an artist during that time and you wanted to portray, that's the tapestry. And if you wanted to portray something, I don't know, envy, there was, he sort of went through all the classic texts and he looked at everything and sort of compiled them. And then he said what kind of attributes the person, and it was always, human, should be carrying or wearing, or what their hair should be like, should be an old woman, a young woman, a man, or whatever. And that was envy or whatever it was supposed to represent. And I found that so fascinating. And even on this tapestry, there's most of these people are actually historical or sometimes mythological, and they're labeled. But there are a few that are like Victory, and it's, a woman. And let me see, what are some of the other ones?
Well, if you look at the image that we have up right now, for example, the women are wearing period dress, of course, and they're carrying palm fronds.
Right.
So this could be a symbol of one of two different things, right? This could be a symbol of honors and victories, or it could also be a symbol of martyrdom. The palm frond was a symbol of martyrdom. And so there exactly is an issue with iconography, right? It's not always totally exact. And so we can actually wind up getting led down strange roads. Artists too in this period were so adept at taking something that had a meaning according to Ripa and kind of turning it towards their own ends. So if we think about like the Arnolfini wedding portrait, there's a little dog on the floor. So that can be a symbol of fidelity, Fidos, Fido. So thinking about a dog and faithfulness, but of course the dog can also symbolize bestiality. And so it's a really, really interesting way of thinking about how an artist might actually be kind of playing with symbols in this fascinating way that maybe not even the owner would understand.
Yeah, but they had this, if we can go back to let's see, it's number 37. Well, this one's fine too. But the other thing that I've been really interested in is, because I'm in working on this piece about honor, I'm flipping from ideas about honor in the 16th century and then ideas about honor today, and just thinking about, why does our society even have honor? What's it for, and why was it developed, and how does it order our society? And I really think, especially if you look at this, if you go back one to number 37, slide 37, and you see how ordered this is. It's almost like a chart. It's the dishonorable examples on the bottom, and then the honorable on the top two. But anyway, so it's been fascinating to sort of try to figure out why honor is even around, why it's useful for us to sort. And also, the other thing that I started to find is that you can't think about honor without thinking about humiliation and shame. You can't have one without the other. Mm-hmm. And that's been something that's been and anyway, what made me think about that is there's visual signs of honor. Mm-hmm. So they have swords, they have scepters, they have crowns. What are visual signs of honor? You also see it in the military. They're like better than Cesare Ripa. They have their medals and their ribbons, and they all have meanings, and they have their own visual signs of honor that they wear in their costume. That's, to me, is really fascinating. We have corsages now, and Texas actually has this very interesting corsage tradition, but that I won't go into right now. But let's see, what was I talking about? And the other thing that I've started to think about with this particular, if you go back one and show the whole tapestry, so that's number 37. Could you go back one? Yeah. Okay, so this tapestry is huge. It's like 25 feet wide or something, and maybe it's 25 feet high. I mean, it's huge. You can't see the top when if you look, well, I'm not going to be able to do this on the image, but anyway, it's huge, and everything is really ordered. And when I've talked to different art historians, they say that it's mimicking a tableau vivant, which was part of the joyous entry or the royal entry. So when a ruler would come to town, there was this elaborate theatrical production, and this is pre-theater as we know it. So this elaborate theatrical production, like a parade, and the ruler and his entourage would stop at different stations along the way to look at something like this, but with real people in a tableau vivant. And it was all about honoring the ruler. And it was one of the forms of public entertainment and public theater. And then there was the opposite, which was the public execution, which was also a state generated form of theater. And I won't even go into that. You can't even believe, you can if you've watched Game of Thrones. It's worse than Game of Thrones, actually. I mean, some of the stuff they would do. But it was for an audience. And in some places, if you didn't show up, you were required to show up and be in the audience. You'd have to pay a fine if you did not show up. Anyway, thinking of all that stuff in terms of theater has been really interesting to me too. I mean, I grew up a Girl Scout. When I started this piece, I thought, oh, honor's a good thing and it means being honest. No, not necessarily. Mm-hmm. It all depends on your peer group and what passes as honor in your group. I mean, we have honor killings. Yes. And that's not, I don't think that's right. But in that world, in that group, that's honor. That's how they defined it.
Well, an honor for men and honor for women were often distinctly different things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems like in history for women, it's all about their virginity.
Yes.
And a lot of the men's honor has to do, they have their own thing going on with battles and this, that, and the other, but a lot of it is protecting their daughters or their wives' virginity. I mean, when you think about how much it's, for women, it was all about sex, all of it, Anyway. it's very strange to sort of like get into all of this.
Yes. So this is the tapestry that you've been researching. This is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a relatively recent acquisition for them. And as you're starting to envision honor as a performance or maybe a certain amount of an installation or something like that, will you be working directly with the tapestry? How will you use it aside from it being an inspiration for you?
The tapestry is where I'm starting my whole lecture. Like I've done 3 of these, and so one was called "When a Priest Marries a Witch," which is about my Catholic. They all start from very specific sort of stories, and then I sort of go out from there. So this is the first time I'm doing it that's not a personal story. And I'm starting with the tapestry. And the way that the piece is developed is I'm using Carole King's Tapestry album as a way to sort of unpack this. And it's working, actually. You know, it's
interesting.
So, well, there's so many interesting things about the Tapestry album. First of all, the whole idea of crafts. And she's working on a needlepoint, which is, by the way, not tapestry. But the whole idea of why there was a crafts revival during that time. And she's in Laurel Canyon. That's a photograph in her house in Laurel Canyon. And it's taken the same time the Renaissance Festival started, which was also this people, why did they start looking back to the Renaissance? And it was a kind of a hippie thing and a counterculture thing, and it really influenced clothing and fashion at the time, which is why she has a song called Tapestry, which is a mock, it's not the best on the album, but it's a mock fable from a mock Renaissance time. I mean, all of that stuff comes together. And then I start, the Monkees, I don't know if you know who the Monkees are.
I know who the Monkees are, but maybe not all of our audience does.
Okay, so they were a rock pop band, very successful, but they were put together by Paramount for a TV show. So they didn't come together naturally; they were cast as actors, and their first albums, their first songs, they didn't have that much to do with them. I mean, they might sing on it, but it was completely studio controlled and studio produced. And for example, the drummer never even had played the drums before, but they became wildly successful. And then they started trying to make their own music because this was also with Carole King, this was the time of the singer-songwriter. Before that, it was all Tin Pan Alley. I mean, nobody asked Frank Sinatra, did you write your own song? You know, I mean, but then there was this idea of authenticity that started becoming very important to people. So anyway, the Monkees always had this kind of asterisk by their name because it's like they weren't authentic. They weren't a real band. And so, and some of that story is really interesting because 2 of the guys were actors, and the actor said, look, if you believe I'm a rock star, I'm doing my job. That is an authentic performance. That is authentic in what I'm trying to do. But the 2 guys in the group who were actually musicians were ashamed because they didn't write or produce their own music. So that's another example of honor group. Who's your honor group? What do they consider honorable? So anyway, it's amazing how you can use Carole King's Tapestry album and just sort of unpack a lot of the things that are in this 16th century tapestry.
I have to say I did not anticipate that we were going to go to the Monkees, but I'm here for you. I like it. I'm down with this. I think I'll give you one last question about this, and we've been talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll turn it back over to our MC.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned to me that you've been thinking a lot about the Black Plague as well, because this is, it sweeps Europe throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and even a little bit later than that. And obviously we have certain resonances with that now, since we are all, experiencing our own plague diets and things like that. How do you intend for the piece to speak to that? And if it will, how is it going to do that? And if you bring in the monkeys with that, I will be so happy.
I haven't figured out how to bring in the monkeys with
all right.
that one. But it's interesting because in reading a lot about this time period, you run across the plague all the time, and there's lots of books just on the plague, and it's fascinating. And but I originally thought, maybe I'll mention it, but I have so much other stuff to talk about, and who cares, right? And now it's like, yeah, people care, because the only way they knew how to fight it was to get out of town and to isolate in the same way we're doing. And the other interesting thing is, this happened for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I mean, this wasn't something that just happened once and then they figured it out and they went on their life. This was like a way of life. Yeah. Anyway, I've just started, dipping back into that. So I'm not quite sure how to approach it. I mean, people were thinking about HIV in terms of plague. Yeah. And although the interesting thing was, the whole Carole King Tapestry album was a free love sort of era, and it was pre that. It was and the HIV, the AIDS plague has changed the way we look at sex totally. Because if you look at films or anything from that era, you're just like, wow, you're just like, whatever you feel like doing, you just do it. And when there's no precaution, and they didn't have to think about it. They had penicillin. If they got STDs, they could figure that out. Anyway, there's so many things and places to go, but I don't, all that is to say, I don't know how it's going to fit in.
Well, before I turn it back over, is there anything else that you want to tell us about your work or about your process that I haven't asked you about and that you'd really like us to know?
No, I don't think I can. No, I don't really, I can't think of anything offhand that's of major importance.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I've truly enjoyed it. And so now we'll turn it over to the questions.
Thank you both for that. All this talk of the Catholic theater the theater of Catholicism has been super interesting, especially in our Puritan nation. There seems like there's something subversive about looking into that, and also some Catholic school trauma as well. We have, our first question comes from Los Angeles-based artist Lauren Bond. Lauren, I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question. Lauren, you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much for this incredibly interesting conversation. I was wondering, what are the icons that speak to you now that have interested you for the longest time? Are there things from the lexicon of iconology that have motivated you all throughout your career? And do some of those still carry the same meaning that they may have in Egyptian, Greek, or Roman iconography?
I don't really know if there are any icons that have been important to me. In some ways, I think I'm more interested in the idea of icons. One of the things that I've been looking at now is that at the Institute for Advanced Studies, where my husband and I have been spending some time, he has a job there, and they have the symbol for the Institute for Advanced Studies is this icon that comes from history of truth and beauty. And it's two beautiful young women. One's naked and one's in like a Greek robe. And I keep thinking, here we are, it's 2020. Why are there two women who, and one's naked, and they're both young, you know, and they're both pretty. And why is that truth and beauty? You know, that kind of thing is interesting to me. Like, how did that, why, you know? And I don't have the answer yet. I haven't figured it out. But I think figuring that out is what's interesting to me. And I've been thinking about, like, people talk about Judy Garland as an icon. And I was thinking, why is that? And I think it's because she's this really interesting mix of honor and humility, or honor and shame. I mean, there's not many people that have both of those things going on, you know, and in such an extreme way. And so I think that, I think for me, it's more interesting figuring out why people are icons and why symbols are icons than being attracted to particular ones.
That makes a lot of sense. It's such an exciting conversation. I wish I could talk more. I will leave time for other people, but just to say, I've been thinking about Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz quite a bit as a icon of the unhoused community in relationship to what we're all going through with the shelter in place, because of course her journey begins because Auntie M somehow thinks it's fine to go into the storm cellar without Dorothy, who goes looking for her dog. I think there's a vulnerability about her iconography that's interesting. But thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. We also have a question from Anthony Hawley. Anthony, I'm going to under arena. There we are.
Hi.
Anthony, there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for doing this. I just had a couple questions. I was fortunate enough to see When a Priest Marries a Witch and body cast at Countercurrent in Houston with Lily Taylor. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about speech and language and the kind of, I guess I'm not sure if this is the right word, but ventriloquism that you use in the performances, and just about a little bit about that strategy, or what made you start doing that?
Well, there's kind of a long story about how I started doing it. It was like, I tried many different things out over the years. When I first started doing it, the very first performance ever, it was with the actor Paul Lazar, and he had me recorded on an iPod in his ear. And I also, in the hall, had my voice going along with him. Anyway, and then it's all developed from there. And now the way I do these pieces is I'm on stage and I'm reading it live, and it goes into the actor's ear, and I read it quietly so it doesn't interrupt. But you can tell it's me, it's my story, I'm telling it, but it's being channeled through a professional actor. And to me, it took years to finally hit on that framework and that form. But one of the things that it does for me is it sort of brings up these ideas of authenticity. Like you saw it with Lily. Lily's obviously not me, and you know that's not me. And but she is I'm so fascinated too by the whole idea of what a trained actor can do. I mean, they project their voice. And we worked with a director, Lee Sunday Evans, who helped shape the performance and told her how to enunciate certain things or to land here. And she always, the interesting thing to me is Lily, Fran, Paul, they take the temperature of the audience. It's always interesting for me to hear what they thought about the audience after a performance, because it really is a relationship between the audience, which becomes like a body, a community body in and of itself, and the performer, and also how different it can be every night. I mean, that's the amazing thing about live performance. But anyway, I'm really interested in what that kind of format says about authenticity. And also, I'm a lot of times after these performances, people say, "Did you make that up?" I didn't. It's all stuff that really happened, but my memory's fallible. Maybe it's not quite. I mean, or I saw it through my eyes. So the truth, is there. I mean, I try, as hard as I can to get to it, but it's all filtered through me and through how I saw it. So anyway.
Thank you. That's great.
Muted. Thanks, Anthony. Suzanne, I had a question. You've been mentioning honor and honor groups throughout this conversation, and I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about how the idea of an honor group relates to your work, Farmhouse Whorehouse.
I've never thought about it as, I don't know. I've never thought about an honor group as with Farmhouse Whorehouse. I don't know how to answer that. I really haven't thought about Farmhouse Whorehouse in terms of honor. The way I ended up structuring that piece was comparing, because my grandparents had a small farm in LaGrange, Texas, and right across the street was the Chicken Ranch, which was the most famous whorehouse in Texas that became a movie, Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, with Dolly Parton and Burt Reynolds. It's also almost unwatchable. I had to watch it in sections because I just couldn't sit through the whole thing, but I had to do it for this piece. Anyway, so the way I set that up was contrasting those two lifestyles, and what's the same and what's different. And my own take as a kid growing up about what a farming life was like, and what a life of prostitution was like, which I got through the French Impressionists because of Toulouse-Lautrec and everybody else that painted those paintings.
Very cool. Thank you for that. Lauren Bond in the chat said, how about honor group and being an audience as well, which is a nice
Oh,
thought.
that's interesting. An honor group is being an audience. There are certain things that you do, like you clap, right? And there's a way to shame the performer by booing or just leaving or
Throwing tomatoes.
Well, nobody does that anymore, but and people hardly ever boo anymore, but it does happen. I mean, I think now people just get up and leave, but there's a real, when anything's live like that, there's a real way to honor people or shame them. And the standing ovation, that's an honor. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I mean, there's so many interests manifested. I mean, I'm just, and like I said, when I started, I just thought, oh, I know what honor is. I was a Girl Scout. I thought of it as honesty, really. It's not that. So anyway.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Dana Phillips. Dana, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Great. Hi, Susan. I'm a huge fan of your work. I really am inspired by a lot of the performance and the textiles that you kind of mix all together. But my question was, do you have any current artists that you are looking at that you're excited about that you wanted to talk about?
Oh God, there's so many artists that I like. Actually, since we were just looking at photos of all the women that are in Valley, I love all of their work. I mean, I think about their work a lot. I can't think of anybody, I mean, I mentioned earlier in this that I've been reading a lot of Samuel Beckett, and I've been trying to figure out, like, he's got such a strange mind, and one of the interesting things to me about Samuel Beckett's work is how visual it is. Mm-hmm. If you look at, there's, I think, what is the one where everybody's in a big jug? I think there's a couple like that, but there's one called, I think it's Play, where 3 people and all you see is their heads. And so it's like sculpture, You know, he really figures things out visually, and the visual setup of the stage really gives the play meaning. And so I've been thinking about that a lot.
Great. Thank you.
Nice. Thanks, Dana. We have a question from our own publisher, Fong Bui. Fong, I think you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Amanda.
Hi, Fawn.
Hi, Fong.
For this wonderful conversation. I want to ask a question in regarding to gesture, because you talk about honor and shame. I immediately came to mind of when the last time I was at the Scovani Chapel in Milan, looking at Giotto, particularly at the portrait of Christ, when at the time in 1304, when he made that fresco, it was rather controversial. How simply Christ himself as the God never been portrayed in profile before ever. Really.
Wow.
You know, he monumentalized and seen portrayed in front of you. He seemed bigger than anyone else that we see in previous fresco and mosaic and whatnot. Certainly in Gothic period. But up to that point, only the devil was being portrayed in profile, because the devil was sneaky, you know, doing sneaky things, you know, tiptoeing around things. But in that instance, both Christ and Judas was portrayed in profile, equally looking at one another, only separated by less than an inch. From, if who's the one who really the guilty one here? In other words, Giotto put the two of them confronted each other in equal terms. So I'm just how some of that gesture is consciously orchestrated, particularly.
Well, one of the things that made me think about is, you know, I was raised Catholic, and in my Catholic church, there was a big crucifix, huge, behind the altar. And, you know, it was Jesus, you know, he had the little loincloth on and with blood coming out, he's nailed to the cross. I grew up with that. I never thought of it as, you know, what it really is, which is a public execution that was made, and he wasn't the only one that happened to. I mean, if you think about how strange it is that the symbol of the Catholic Church, and you know what I used to wear around my neck, was a man being tortured and publicly executed, and that's what you kneel down and pray to. I mean, when I started thinking about it, I mean, it's not that I didn't know he was being executed, but it's presented to you when you grow up as just this almost like a benign symbol, almost like a talisman that you pray to and ask things of, maybe. But when you start thinking about the history of it, I mean, even the Catholic Mass, it's a meal, it's bread and it's wine, and it's done at a table, and we're all in the audience, which is the way kings used to eat back then, because the king would eat on a stage, and it would just be them, the king eating, and the rest of the people were somewhere else watching that. And I'm thinking, that's where that came from? You know, all of that stuff is just so strange once you start looking at it and realizing that it's still so alive today. Anyway, and a lot of those nuns in the dialogue of the Carmelite piece, they have the dead Jesus around. I mean, I never thought of it that way. It was just a symbol. But when you think of what the symbol really is, it's very, very strange.
That's actually something that comes up a lot in medieval art history, is people of other faith traditions in the period who may belong to faith traditions that weren't interested in iconography or representation, being really appalled by the idea that Catholics would worship an executed God. And just like not being able really to fathom what that means. And you're totally right. It's crazy when you're raised in that tradition to then start to think about like, wow, that is what's going on.
and there's this strange twist that I think in Catholic theology, whereas their God is being shamed.
Mhm.
So there's a public shaming, and somehow that brings honor.
Yeah.
So that's a really, like, what does that all mean? I don't know. I'm still trying to like wrap my head around it all.
Suzanne, are you friend with Mark Epstein, the great Buddhist and
Oh
Freud?
yeah, Mark, yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, Mark and I have been talking about this great idea because I grew up as a Buddhist, but then went to a Catholic school.
Oh.
So we were talking about how it differs so dramatically because the idea of nirvana, when Buddha is trying to be enlightened under the Bodhi tree, the idea of nirvana means not being there. And you see the image in slow footage of the Buddhist monk burning himself during the war in Vietnam on the street. If you look closely, when he put the gasoline in himself and lit the fire, I mean, it burst forth very powerfully, violently, but there's no facial expression. There's no expression of hurt or sensation from the heat because he already left. It's just a piece of wood burning, really. And
Wow.
the invention of the crucifix and or the gesture, for example, the pietà is so powerful. It's a painting invention because I don't think we would gain compassion for example, the Abu Ghraib picture of the hooded man on the box. It's because of the gesture of mercy. It's not that dissimilar from the naked Vietnamese young girl running away from napalm bomb. So technical images is invented out of the old painted icon, painting that Amanda was talking earlier. So anyway, I think that it's implicit, but it's also very subtle in those screens, how those performers moving in your last installation in Art Cake. Maybe it was, unconsciously done, but it's very emotionally invested and very subtle. So anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all. I think that's probably a great time to wrap up our conversation. We have a tradition at the Rail of closing all of our poems with a lunch. No, all of our lunches with a poem, I think is what I meant to say. And today our managing director, Sophia, is going to read something for us. Let's see, Sophia, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Hello. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I will be reading a poem called History by Paul Muldoon. Where and when exactly did we first have sex? Do you remember? Was it Fitzroy Avenue or Cromwell Road or Notting Hill, your place or mine, Marseille or Aix, or as long ago as that Thursday evening when you and I climbed through the bay window on the ground floor of Aquinas Hall and into the room where McNeice wrote Snow, or the room where they say he wrote Snow. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's great.
Thank you, Sophia.
Really.
Love Paul Muldoon always. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Suzanne and Amanda. This was an incredible conversation, a great close to the week. Just a reminder that next week we have another amazing roster of guests, starting on Monday with the graphic designer behind Queer Archive Work, Paul Suellis, hosted by our art books editor, Megan Liberty. Everyone's going to be able to unmute themselves now so you can say goodbye on your way out. And I hope everyone has a restful and lovely weekend. Thanks all.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Sophia.
Bye.
Suzanne.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Have a
Hey,
great
Bob.
weekend.
Hey, Dorothea.
Hey, hi, Dorothea.
Ciao, Bob. Thanks for coming again.
Hey, Charlie. Hi,
Hey,
Melissa.
Zai.
Fog.
Hi.
Hey, Justin.
Bye, Aggie. Have a great
Thanks.
weekend.
Hey, Marina. Good
Thanks,
to see
Marina.
Hey, Rachel.
Hi. Hey, Bob.
you. Adios, Jeffrey.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you again.
Ciao, Dorothea.
Ooh,
Have a great
Sai, is that a pigeon?
Justin,
nest?
thanks for that link. That was really cool to see. I appreciate that a lot.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Hey, Andrew.
Whoa!
Wow.
Bird.
Cool, Sai. Thanks for that.
Sai, that's awesome, man.
Beautiful.
Is that thing, is that taxidermied or is that a live creature?
No, it's real.